A teenager accused of murdering a little boy takes the stand. Cody Metzker-Madsen says, yes, he beat 5-year-old Dominic Elkins with a brick. But he says he was lost in a fantasy when it happened. On the stand, a new story unfolded.
Cody Metzker-Madsen was charged with first-degree murder in August 2013 in regards to the death of his foster brother Dominic Elkins. He was 17 years old at the time and his brother was only 5. The boy's body was found at the bottom of a ravine, and an autopsy showed that Dominic died of blunt force head injuries in conjunction with drowning. Cody would testify in court that he had powerful fantasies and at the time thought that he was killing a goblin, not his brother. Cody Metzker-Madsen had a difficult life from the very start. Born into a troubled home in Iowa, he lived in a trailer with his mother and his step-grandfather living in the trailer next door. Social worker Heidi DeKrauf would testify that she believed his step-grandfather was very abusive towards Cody. On one visit, she saw the older man strike Cody in the head with a cup. Quote, "It definitely looked like it hurt, because I remember Cody cowering afterwards." End quote. The grandfather was reported to constantly swear and yell at Cody, and would sit in a recliner in his trailer and hit the boy with a fly swatter if he were to get in the way of the television. Mary Bouman, another social worker, stated that his mother was addicted to smoking crystal meth and was using the substance for 3 months while she was pregnant with Cody. During this period, she was unaware that she was pregnant, and when this became apparent to her, she quit cold turkey. In regards to the effect meth can have on a child during pregnancy, Mary Bouman would say, "The studies that I have been able to look at have said it does change the brain chemistry. Children who've been exposed in utero are more likely to have low birth weights, be developmentally delayed, and be aggressive." Cody was also diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and oppositional defiant disorder, both common in children whose mothers had meth present in their system during pregnancy. Over the course of Cody's trial, 13 witnesses were called in the defense of him, who gave detailed reports of the teen's history with mental health issues, hallucinations, violent behavior, and abuse. Michelle Armitage, who was the teen's academic advisor, said Metzker-Madsen would sometimes get violent if he wasn't first in line or if other children angered him, yet he would always cry and apologize afterwards. Quote, "If you said, 'You kicked me or hurt me,' he would be like, 'Well, I didn't mean to.' It was almost like he didn't know that he'd actually hurt you." End quote. Armitage testified that she was worried about him when he went into foster care, saying, "I worried what type of foster care he would go to, because even though I think he was highly intelligent, he was very immature, and I worried about his interactions with younger kids."
Well, first off, the way you're saying it is kind of hurting my feelings in a way, because I'm figuring that you don't really believe me, do you?
Other school administrators wouldn't let Metzker-Madsen play with other kids during his recess for safety reasons. One would go on to say, "We were just concerned with how he would behave around other students. We were just not confident that we were going to be able to keep everyone safe." Another witness was Christy Gauchignon, a high school principal in the Logan Magnolia School District, in which Cody had spent a few months before being transferred to a school for children with emotional and behavioral disorders. They testified that Cody once hallucinated in the school cafeteria, telling people that there were snakes on the floor. Christy said, often when the teen got angry, he would talk about his black eyes. He would tell people, "You don't want to see my black eyes. My black eyes will hurt you." Cody also stated that at one point, he saw a cloaked figure in the ravine where his brother was killed. He told police officers that he'd often seen this ominous figure glaring at him, and that he was the only person who could see it. The officer asked, "Does he show up when bad things happen?" And Cody replied, "Right outside the house, in the woods. He's always glaring at me." Metzker-Madsen was known to create elaborate fantasy games and claimed to have an imaginary friend who spoke a language that only he could understand. Cody would be transported to this fantasy world which he and others who knew him dubbed Codyland. This place had slightly different colors and smells and is inhabited with mythological creatures that only Cody could see.
My own world is pretty hard to explain.
Whilst he was on the stand, he was questioned with what it was that he would like to tell the judge, and Cody responded with,
Well, basically the truth. It looked like there were goblins, per se. A lot of them. Green, ugly little creatures.
Do you remember hitting the goblin in the head with the brick multiple times?
Yes, multiple times, yes. I started pushing his head into the water as I was hitting him with the brick. Now I know that I did hurt Dominic.
You killed him.
Yes. I love the little guy. I would never hurt him, not even a hair on his freaking little head.
I was playing with Dominic and entered my own world while we were playing. My own world is pretty hard to explain. Whilst Cody was in this world, he saw an army of goblins. Green, ugly little creatures that were fighting people he knew. He battled the Goblin Commander and drove him into a ravine where he continued to strike the goblin with a sword and a brick. After killing the goblin, his vision continued and he ran off to help another ally who was being attacked. When asked by authorities if he knew that he killed his brother, or if he wanted to harm him in any way, Cody said, "No, I did not. I loved the little guy. I would never hurt him, not even a hair on his frickin' head." After Dominic's body was discovered, Cody gave multiple stories to police about what happened to his brother. This would be the main argument for the prosecution. They would say that if Cody was able to give so many varying stories as to what happened to his brother before settling on the goblin story, he absolutely knew what he was doing as he tried to deflect blame from himself. Cody, though, said that he told varying versions of his story based on symbols that he saw on top of people's heads that indicated whether he could trust them or not, and he didn't want people to think that he was crazy by revealing this. Peggy Madsen, who is Cody's biological mother, took the stand and talked about how she had custody of Cody until he was 7 years old, and even when he was no longer in her care, she was still able to continue visitation. Madsen said that she knew her son had imaginary friends and liked to pretend that he was many different characters. He often acted out multiple characters at once as they all spoke with each other. She believed that her son continued to play with these friends beyond an age that was considered normal, and claimed that she had become nervous when he still had imaginary friends beyond the age of 10. During day 6 of the trial, experts would argue very differing opinions about Cody's mental state at the time of the incident.
In my opinion, he felt that what he was doing at that moment was justified. It was the thing to do to protect himself and to protect this imaginary world.
It's my opinion that at the time of the incident, Mr. Metzker-Madsen did not suffer any acute psychiatric condition that would have prevented him from being able to understand the nature and consequences of his actions.
The defense would argue that Cody had an understanding that he killed a human, but no comprehension that he had done it. They would say that the extreme fantasy nature of his world, disconnected from reality, led him to believe that he truly was killing a goblin, and that he would be praised for his act. And they argued that the differing stories were due to his fear that he would be considered crazy and his imaginary world would come under threat. The prosecution would argue, though, that he did not have a psychotic episode, as psychotic episodes tend to take much longer for them to dissipate, and Cody's immediate and jarring entry into his own world, then re-entry into our reality, indicates that he did not suffer any sort of psychotic episode and knew exactly what it was that he was doing.
He played the game differently than what you wanted, didn't he?
Yeah, but I didn't mind. I mean, the little guy was cute whenever he played like that.
This is further backed up by his lies and multiple stories of what happened. Lies and deflection to avoid taking responsibility for his actions. As the trial concluded, Cody would be deemed not guilty by reason of insanity, a very rare win that is not often seen in our court systems. Here is a full reading of the facts found by the courts. On August 31st, 2013, Cody Metzker-Madsen was a 17-year-old youth living with his foster family in rural Harrison County, Iowa. He turned 18 years old on February 19, 2014. Metzker-Madsen had been in the Julie and Don Kuhlman foster home for about 3 years, following a series of out-of-home placements that started when he was 6 years old. The Kuhlmans were experienced foster parents. They also had twin daughters who were then 12 years old. A foster child, Dominic Elkins, joined the Kuhlman family about 3 weeks before August 31. Dominic was 5 years old. Despite the difference in their ages, Dominic and Cody Metzker-Madsen played together. Cody enjoyed creating games based upon characters from mythology, science fiction stories, television, and video games. On the Kuhlman property were a large yard, a swimming pool, timber, miniature horses, dogs, a cat, and a steep ravine to occupy the children. The boys also enjoyed video games. In the late afternoon or early evening of August 31, Don Kuhlman and a friend were away from home riding motorcycles. Julie Kuhlman and one of the Kuhlman daughters drove into town about 10 minutes away to buy ice cream for the family. The other 12-year-old daughter, Rebecca, was inside the house watching television. Cody Metzker-Madsen and Dominic were playing outdoors. Before Julie returned with ice cream, Metzker-Madsen came into the house. He told Rebecca that he could not find Dominic. Cody appeared to Rebecca to be panicky and muddy. She went outside with him and they started to look for Dominic in the yard. Rebecca also telephoned her mother, who was nearly home. Julie Kuhlman arrived at the residence within minutes. Cody Metzker-Madsen ran up to Julie Kuhlman and told her that Dominic had run away into a ravine on the Kuhlman property. He led her to an area of the ravine that Julie believed could not have been the place where Dominic disappeared, because the tall grass and weeds were undisturbed. She urged Metzker-Madsen to help her find Dominic. Cody then led the searchers to the opposite end of the property and a different part of the ravine. Dominic was found by his foster sister, face down in the water at the bottom of the ravine. She rolled him over and attempted to resuscitate him. Her efforts were futile. An autopsy revealed that Dominic died from blunt force trauma or drowning. Tests showed that Dominic's blood was splattered on Metzker-Madsen's shirt and shorts. Larger blood stains on defendant's clothing indicated he had been in contact with Dominic's body. Cody Metzker-Madsen provided several versions of what happened to Dominic. He said that Dominic fell from a tree limb or branch that broke and tumbled into the ravine. He told the Kuhlmans and investigators that night that Dominic hit himself in the head with a brick. He told investigators that Dominic supposedly, flat in the water, threw a brick at him from the bottom of the ravine more than 20 feet to the top, where Cody was looking down at the child. Metzker-Madsen also told DCI investigators that he and Dominic were playing Greeks and Romans. He described the type of sabers the Greek player used, compared to that used by the Roman. He told investigators that he went through a portal or barrier when the game started. He said, "I didn't know he would actually drown." When the investigators let Cody know that they did not believe him, he then told them about a cloaked man he had seen that night in the ravine and had seen on other occasions. He told the investigators that the man deep in the ravine had different colored eyes, an observation that he would have had to make in the dark from the top of the ravine. He speculated that the cloaked man must have tripped Dominic and drowned him, because he doesn't drown that easily. He's a fighter, I know that. He told the investigators that he was not the kind of guy who would kill a kid. The agents left the interview room for a few minutes, leaving Metzker-Madsen alone. He voiced his displeasure when he found an agent's tape recorder and realized the interview was being recorded. In February 2014, about 6 months after Dominic's death, Metzker-Madsen met with clinical psychologist Alan Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein is board certified in forensic psychology. He is licensed in Iowa, New York, and Connecticut. Dr. Goldstein reviewed over 1,500 pages of records related to Metzker-Madsen's mental health treatment, hospitalizations, evaluations, and placement facilities. He also reviewed the recorded interview of Cody by state investigators, investigative materials, the trial information, and minutes of testimony. Over the course of 2 days, Dr. Goldstein administered psychological tests to Metzker-Madsen and asked him to tell him about Dominic's death. Dr. Goldstein described that keeping Cody on task was demanding and exhausting, not surprising given the young man's history of attention problems. After about 5 hours on that first day, Goldstein asked the defendant what he believed was the evidence the state had against him. Cody was eventually able to describe the state's evidence. When asked what he thought his chances would be at trial, defendant said that they were not very good. Dr. Goldstein told Cody he agreed that his chances were not good based upon the evidence. Metzker-Madsen then put his head down and cried briefly. He told Goldstein that he thought he had to tell him what happened. Dr. Goldstein agreed that he would return the next day for Metzker-Madsen to tell him what happened. The doctor testified that the next day, Metzker-Madsen was initially not willing to talk with him. After administering several psychological tests, the doctor told defendant that there were no more tests to give, and that if he wanted to talk about what happened, this was the time. Over the course of the next several hours, Metzker-Madsen told Goldstein that he had waged a battle with a goblin. He and the goblin were at the top of the ravine. This goblin was dressed differently than others in the area, marking him as the leader. Metzker-Madsen described in detail how the goblin went down the ravine, and how the defendant used special weapons or gear that he wore in a pack around his waist to fight the creature. He bludgeoned and drowned the goblin to make sure he was dead. Metzker-Madsen's trial testimony followed a course very similar to his description of the events to Dr. Goldstein. He described playing Roman mythology outside with Dominic. He then went into one of his worlds that resembled a video game. Once he was in that world, he saw goblins fighting people that he knew. The commander of the goblins was in front of him near the edge of the ravine. Cody attacked the Goblin Commander toward the edge of the ravine and kicked him into a tree branch. The goblin's head hit the branch. Cody went down the ravine after the goblin. He reached into a pack belted to his waist for his weapons, a sword and a brick. He attacked the goblin and smashed the brick into his face. He pushed its head into the water as he hit him. Even after it was still, Cody did not trust that the goblin was dead, because according to him, sometimes goblins re-emerge and attack again. They are kind of tricky little creatures. Metzker-Madsen testified that he did not realize at the time that he was battling the goblin, that the creature was, in fact, Dominic. In addition to the evaluation by Dr. Goldstein, Cody Metzker-Madsen also was evaluated by psychiatrist James Dennett. Dr. Dennett is board certified in psychiatry and neurology, is licensed in Iowa, and has over 30 years of clinical experience in treating people with mental illness. Dr. Dennett reviewed the Dr. Goldstein's report and notes of his interview with the defendant, as well as the competency evaluations completed after Metzker-Madsen's arrest. He reviewed the investigative report and recorded interview of Metzker-Madsen by DCI agents. Because this interview took place within hours of Dominic's death, Dr. Dennett opines that it gave him good insight into Cody's state of mind at the time of the assault. In his experience, people who suffer from acute psychosis, delusions, or hallucinations do not instantly or quickly move from that psychotic state to a non-psychotic state. Dr. Dennett pointed to Metzker-Madsen's lies to the Kuhlmans and to investigators as compelling evidence that the defendant knew, on August 31, that what he had done to Dominic was wrong. Cody told Dr. Dennett during the October 2014 evaluation that he lied in order to gain time to talk to an attorney. Dr. Dennett opined that Metzker-Madsen's description of killing the goblin, disclosed for the first time to Dr. Goldstein months after Dominic's death, was another fabrication to deflect responsibility from himself. The court makes the following conclusions of law. The state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt each of the elements of murder first degree. On or about August 31, 2013, the defendant beat and or drowned Dominic Elkins. Dominic Elkins died as a result of being beaten and or drowned. Dominic Elkins was under the age of 14. The defendant acted with malice aforethought. The defendant was committing the crime of assault. Dominic Elkins' death occurred under circumstances showing an extreme indifference to human life. In this case, there is no dispute that Cody Metzker-Madsen used a brick or rock and repeatedly hit Dominic Elkins about the head, mouth, chest, and abdomen. There is no dispute that Metzker-Madsen held Dominic face down in the water to be sure that the child was dead. 5-year-old Dominic died as a result of Metzker-Madsen's assault. The repeated blows exposed the front and back of the child's skull, split his upper lip, smashed his jaw, broke out some of his teeth, bruised his small body, and resulted in blood splattering on Metzker-Madsen's clothing. All of these circumstances indicate an extreme indifference to human life. The state has shown substantial evidence from which a trier of fact could determine that Cody Metzker-Madsen acted with malice aforethought. Malice is a state of mind which leads one to intentionally do a wrongful act to the injury of another, out of actual hatred or with an evil or unlawful purpose. Malice aforethought is a fixed purpose or design to do some physical harm to another that exists before the act is committed. Malice aforethought may be proven by direct or circumstantial evidence, and from the acts and conduct of the defendant. Malice aforethought need not last for any particular length of time. In this case, there was no lawful purpose for the defendant's repeated and brutal injuries to Dominic. Metzker-Madsen saw the child's skull and blood, yet pushed Dominic's head under the water to be sure he was not breathing and would die. His acts could be construed by a trier of fact to demonstrate his fixed purpose to do great harm to Dominic. The state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt each of the elements of murder in the first degree. The court next considers the defense of insanity. A person is presumed to be sane. In order for the defendant to establish he was insane, he must prove by a preponderance of the evidence either of the following. 1. At the time the crime was committed, the defendant suffered from such a diseased or deranged condition of the mind as to render him incapable of knowing the nature and quality of the acts he is accused of. Or 2. At the time the crime was committed, the defendant suffered from such a diseased or deranged condition of the mind as to render him incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong as to the acts he is accused of. If the defendant has failed to prove either of the elements by a preponderance of the evidence, then the defendant is guilty. In this case, The court heard testimony from 2 expert witnesses, both of whom were qualified to give expert opinions regarding Cody Metzker-Madsen's sanity at the time of the offense. The court observed defendant's testimony and his demeanor throughout the trial. During this trial, the court heard extensive evidence about Metzker-Madsen's history of staring episodes, epilepsy, oppositional behaviors, attention deficits, lies, fantasy characters, and possible hallucinations. This is a young man who has never been mentally normal. While those instances in the past have little direct bearing on Cody Metzker-Madsen's state of mind when he killed Dominic on August 31, 2013, they do show some consistency. Cody is a poor liar. His attempts to deflect blame are unsophisticated. His inner fantasy life is rich. The court has carefully considered Dr. Dennett's opinion that at the time of this incident, Cody did not suffer from any psychiatric illness or psychosis that prevented him from knowing the nature and consequences of his actions, or prevented him from distinguishing right from wrong. The court has also considered Dr. Dennett's opinion that Dr. Goldstein's assessment of the defendant is flawed. However, the court found Dr. Goldstein's evaluation of the defendant to be persuasive. A preponderance of the evidence supports a conclusion that at the time he was inflicting mortal wounds on Dominic, Cody Metzker-Madsen did not understand the nature or consequences of his actions. He believed that he was slaying a goblin foe. He was irrational, and according to Dr. Goldstein, in a psychotic state that prevented him from understanding that it was not a goblin but a child, Dominic, who he had killed. During his interview with DCI agents, during his evaluations by Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Dennert, and during his testimony at trial, Cody Metzker-Madsen appeared to be unaffected by the gravity of his acts against Dominic. He was animated in describing his battle against the goblin. He became testy when confronted with his lies and inconsistencies. However, it is not clear that he appreciates, even now, the consequences of his actions. It is the verdict of the court
that defendant Cody Metzker-Madsen is not guilty of murder in the first degree by reason of insanity. And with that, we will be adjourned. Thank you.
I was reading a scientific journal on schizophrenia, psychosis, and crimes related to mental illness, and I found this excerpt to be rather interesting. Cody was also found to be a danger to himself or others. He will be held in a psychiatric facility until he is judged to be no longer dangerous. This does not mean that he got away with anything. In fact, according to the American Psychiatric Association, individuals who are found not guilty by reason of insanity are often confined to psychiatric hospitals for as long or longer than they would have spent in prison for a conviction. Hollywood depictions and news reports to the contrary. Most people with schizophrenia are not violent. Only 3 to 5% of violent acts are committed by individuals diagnosed with severe mental illness, whereas individuals with severe mental illnesses are more than 10 times as likely to be victims of crime. The most common conditions linked to violence are psychopathic personality, severe antisocial personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and persons who are abusing drugs, especially alcohol. Whether Cody was aware of his actions in this plane of reality, we will never truly know. What is certain, though, is despite the reasoning, this situation was a tragedy for all involved, and has left me hoping that the victims of this crime are able to one day find peace.